good. We're groovy. We're making it happen. All right, y'all. So cool. Last session we started talking a lot about the a little bit deeper understanding of like how React state and props and everything works. And so I wanted to take the time today to recap all of these things, recap like React in a nutshell, and make sure that we're kind of on one accord, understanding all that kind of is going into something that might seem very simple, but at the same time can get very complicated very fast, right? So this was the nice little app we made. You know, I took some time, make it look a little nicer, put my Jawns in the center and whatnot, centered my divs and whatnot, right? But we built a really simple app last time we met that was very simple in what it was attempting to do, but very complicated in how it did it. So essentially, we built an application that put a nice big div in the middle of the screen that we can change colors. And you know, we can move around from the different colors. Clearly, the application is updating. And you know, in a typical scenario, how might an application like this be created? Well, there's HTML that we undoubtedly need, the HTML of the text, the HTML for this big block, the HTML for the buttons, and then there's some CSS, clearly one for the CSS of just the natural styling of this page, as well as the CSS that kind of dictates what color is showing up, right? And then there's JavaScript, because we need these buttons to actively do something. And so in the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, there are all types of things that kind of go on behind the scenes to make this kind of an application work. If you were building this in a normal HTML, CSS, kind of what we call vanilla JavaScript, HTML and CSS application without any extra libraries or whatnot, how might you do this, right? Well, you would have to create the HTML structure.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Black Siri is really ready for me today. I'm sorry. But how would you do this? You would have to create the HTML files, right? That will dictate the structure of the code that you'd want to see. So if we inspect this, something of the sort, something like this, where we would have some different HTML elements that would show up on the screen that would correlate to what we want to see. So we would imagine that we would see some divs, we would imagine that we see some buttons, et cetera, et cetera. And like I mentioned before, we would probably have some CSS that, like a style, CSS style sheet that would define some of the styles for those particular elements and whatnot. And of course, we would connect it to some JavaScript. The thing with JavaScript that is really important to understand, and how JavaScript really is, where JavaScript becomes very useful in the HTML, CSS, and whatnot landscape, is in being able to use JavaScript to update HTML and CSS programmatically. And that is one of the main drawing points to what you would use JavaScript to do, is I'm going to add JavaScript to this website such that the JavaScript can programmatically manipulate the HTML or manipulate the CSS on the specific website that I'm building, right? And the way that JavaScript does that is by way of interface called the HTML DOM. The DOM is shorthand for the document object model, which is essentially an interface that allows for JavaScript to see the HTML structure of your website from the top to the bottom, and all of the elements and attributes that are comprised of inside of that document. So the DOM is an interface that allows for JavaScript to say, hey, what are the different HTML elements on the page? What are the attributes of those different HTML elements, right? Attributes are in the HTML-like context would be the things like styling is an attribute, but also things like the ID and the class, the source, anything that element needs as data and would be considered an attribute of the element. And JavaScript can change and manipulate all of those things, the elements themselves, the attributes each element has, the HTML or the text that's nested inside of another element. And that's what makes the document object model very helpful, is because it can allow you to, it can allow the JavaScript to really dedicatedly transform the landscape of your HTML and your CSS. But, you know, all of this stuff can get very intricate over time, right? As soon as you start using JavaScript to start changing up all of these things, you start having to use a couple of different methods, which we call DOM methods, that allow for you to manipulate the HTML and, you know, identify the elements, manipulate the element, and then, you know, handle all of those things programmatically. And so we've seen some examples of this as we were getting started in this these sessions, talking a lot about the regular kind of HTML DOM. We built a tic-tac-toe game that kind of showed us how we would use JavaScript to manipulate HTML, and just in a very simple sense, or I wouldn't say simple, but in a without using any other libraries. We just could use the JavaScript and these document object model functions like get element by ID and whatnot to like find elements and manipulate elements in the JavaScript, in a JavaScript like context. And so the document object model is like one of the most important things to understand about how JavaScript, HTML, and CSS get connected. It is a very important part of the process of designing these web pages. But as you can see, you know, there's all types of functions that you have to use to either find the element or change the element and add or delete elements. And as soon as you start building out a more sophisticated application, you know, things can get very complicated over time, right? The more that your application starts trying to be interactive, and really JavaScript is what builds the interactivity, the more of these functions you need to use, and the harder it'll be to like have like your JavaScript feel very simple, because at the end of the day, you have to not only do the programming logic of JavaScript, but you also have to do all of this DOM manipulation stuff related to keeping track of your elements, maneuvering them over time, and all of that can become very tedious, right? Is what I'm saying making sense so far? Just throw some thumbs up, you know, there's some like react, so I know that we like y'all hearing what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying? Does this make sense? What I'm getting at here? Like, the document object model is a very important topic, but it also is one that can make what your web design a lot more complicated. If you were just building a beautiful website and you didn't really care about all of these types of transformations or anything, and you didn't use any JavaScript, it was just HTML and CSS. Well, there's a lot of HTML elements, right? There's hundreds of HTML elements, and CSS is also not the easiest thing to learn. There's so much that goes into good styling, but you imagine in a big app where you need a bunch of HTML elements, a bunch of CSS, and JavaScript on top of it, it could get really confusing very quickly. And that is really where React comes in to make things a lot simpler. So rather than having to use JavaScript to manipulate all these things and then have your HTML do all this complicated stuff, and your CSS have to be manipulated by JavaScript in all these unique ways, React is kind of created to help ease that process for us. And so the React library was created as a JavaScript library specifically to help you build your user interfaces. So when we say a user interface, we're talking about a platform that kind of a user will operate on that will then create some kind of actions in the back end of some kind, right? And so the user interface for us mostly in the web is the websites that we're building, these applications that people are going to navigate to. And a lot of times, the more we're building things that are trying to be more sophisticated, the more complicated the interactions we might need on those web pages can be. And that's where React comes in to be a JavaScript library to help us make that process easier. The ways that React does it is like by making it a lot simpler for you to define like the elements you want to see on the screen, using this idea of components to make it so that you can essentially create these little blocks of code that represent the specific visual elements you want to see. And you can reuse those little blocks over and over again to create a much more understandable flow for how your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript combine to form a user interface. So rather than have to have them all separate and then have to use all of these different DOM manipulation functions and use JavaScript for all the DOM stuff and the programmatic stuff like handling button clicks and events in HTML, you can use React to make that process a lot more streamlined. And so in an app like this, right, of course, it doesn't seem like it should be so as complicated to have to use to make an app like this. But if you think about everything that's going into preserving a record of like, what is the current color, being able to understand whenever one of these buttons is being clicked and should trigger something to happen that manipulates that color, and doing so in a way that doesn't necessarily need to refresh the entire screen each time is really not the most it's not a easy task to accomplish. And so let's take a look at the code behind this, and in it we're going to talk about some of the most important concepts of React, and just kind of refresh ourselves as to what it is that we're building when it comes to building out more React-based projects. So just navigating over to VS Code. So I'm just going to close these to start. So there's so many different ways to use React in a new application. We've been talking about Create React App, which is a specific building tool chain that allows us to, as developers, use a specific starter point for our code that will allow us to build these applications that are going to be a lot more interactive and have a lot more complicated user interface data movement that would be easier to represent in another format. The Create React App tool chain allows for you to start a new project very simply in the terminal using the npx Create React App command line tool that allows you to just build a new project. It runs a series of scripts that will essentially generate an entire project for you that already has the right configuration so that you can very easily deploy it, open it up in a server and like develop and see your changes on the server live, just like this application that I have running on the local server now. When you download and when you create a new Create React App project, some of the most important files that kind of are established in there are these files that you see here. So you see, we have a README that they create that's kind of like an initial README that they start. That basically the README is just there for you to have some space for documentation purposes. You can change this to speak more to your project and what it is you're working on. We use READMEs in the developer community as a space for sharing information about projects. We talked about how React is a node-based project, or a node-based Create React App is a node command. And it's a command built into Node, which is Node is a runtime engine for JavaScript, for processing JavaScript. So you use Node to run JavaScript. It is built into the web. The ability to run JavaScript is already built into modern browsers, but if you're trying to run JavaScript on the terminal without a browser specifically, you need to use Node. And so Node is what creates these two files, package.json, package-lock.json, as well as the Node modules folder. The package.json is just it's a JSON file. JSON is a specific data formatting format that is a JavaScript native format that allows you to define some data in a very transferable, easy to transfer way. The responsibility of the package.json is to hold all the metadata for our application, including the name, any of the dependencies that we need to install that are going to help our application run, as well as certain scripts. You can use Node to run scripts in JavaScript, so you can define a script to run, and Node, you can use Node commands to run these specific scripts. And yeah, there's a couple other things that you can add as into your node into your package.json to make your metadata for your project a little bit more sophisticated. The Create React App library starts us off with this basic package.json, but it also we can add to it whatever we want. And when we add new libraries or new packages to our projects, we see those get added here in the dependencies. The package.lock.json is just another, is more of like kind of a version of the same package.json that kind of just keeps track of the different versions of your package.json and the last modules you've installed. So we don't normally change the package-lock.json. It gets updated automatically in Node. Node modules are where all of the libraries get saved. And so one of the most important ones to know is the React library is actually a package of code that is put into our Node modules folder, which is what we can use to interact with some of the specific code that lets React do what React does. And so that is just important to say. And then, all these other things that you see here were other libraries that were necessary to install to have these other libraries run. But, to get back toward the code, the most important files that exist in React are inside of the source directory and then in the public directory. The public directory, the most important file is inside of here is the HTML file, the index.html file that we eventually use JavaScript to write to and eventually run our visual pieces of our application. The big thing to know here is that you need HTML no matter what you do if you're going to build a website. So it's not as though React gets rid of the need of HTML. It just uses some very sophisticated JavaScript to essentially write your HTML file for you by using JavaScript, which is really interesting. This div with the ID of root here in this HTML file becomes essentially the container for all of the code that React ends up building for us as we start building our components and our application out. So that's the most important thing in the public file is just this div with the ID of root, and then the way that then the JavaScript will write into this HTML file over time for us. The more kind of nitty gritty things that are important to know as a developer that's going to start building things in React is that the source folder is where you have all of the code that's relevant to your visual kind of project, right? So the most important, two of the most important files inside of the source directory are your index.js file, which is where Create React App does creates a specific starting point for your application that is called the app.js, or called the app. It's called the app. And this is a component. So Create React App creates one component for you and says, hey, there's going to be this component called app. And inside of the app component, it brings it in and then it renders it. This line from line 7 to line 12 is a very important React function that uses the React library and the React DOM library to essentially render some of the elements inside of this React component, which we'll talk about in a second, to that specific div that we were just looking at in the index.html file. So this render function is very important because if this wasn't written the way it was, we wouldn't actually see anything from the app.js as we were making changes. So the index.js is a boilerplate to get your first component up there and running. And most of what we use, if we're using Create React App, most of what we do is manipulate the app.js so that we can see these visual changes that are going to take place on our site. So that's just a quick little dive back into like kind of the React file structure and how these different pieces of this kind of Create React App tool chain work together. If that all makes sense, give me a thumbs up so I know we good. You know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to sprinkle some love on this. Go ahead, bro.
Good question. Can you explain a little bit? I know you mentioned the last time about the React data strict mode. Like what is the purpose of that?
Yeah, so basically the React strict mode is um, just a how to call it. It's like a tool that like Create React App tool chain builds puts in there as a default that basically will give you stricter error messages and like warnings on things. So this just basically tells React to run in a way that will give you more warnings and errors if things are not built in a more of a best practices way. This actually doesn't really do anything in terms of visual stuff for your app. It doesn't really change anything. You could literally delete it. The only thing that it would change is like the how severe of the warnings would you see in your application.
Got it. Thank you, Professor.
So the most important thing that we're seeing here is that the app is being rendered here at the ID of root. Yeah, that's a great question. Any other questions?
That's good, Professor. Thank you.
Cool. Everybody else, we good? You can throw a thumb up so I know we can keep it pushing. All right. Thank y'all. Appreciate y'all. Thank y'all. Okay, cool. So now that we know, essentially what Create React App is attempting to do for us is to make our process of doing these HTML DOM manipulation functions easier. I do want to point out last thing that you see here in this index.js is there is a DOM manipulation function that takes place in this index.js file, right? The document get element by ID root is one of those DOM functions that is finding a specific element in our HTML document. And then the React DOM render function uses that element very ingeniously to use JavaScript to render the actual HTML elements into that particular space that we just highlight here. So this one little line is doing some very important stuff for how the React library allows us to make the JavaScript do more for us instead of in more kind of ways that are a little bit easier to write and to read and not have to build these very crazy JavaScript files that are a little bit harder to understand without the help of other libraries. But yeah, most of the magic happens in the app.js, which is our first component. This component is the one that eventually gets rendered. So anything that this component renders in itself is going to be showing up. And so components are essentially these very simple objects that return what we call JSX. JSX is a React markup language that allows you to define specific elements, visual elements that will be rendered onto a screen. We can use JSX. So let's take a look at this color container. JSX essentially is a set of these like different like elements that would be rendered on a screen. So we see this div, we see this H1, and of course we can make our own blocks of components, which are our own blocks of these elements of these JSX elements that we can use and call in different files. And that is what a component is. So I think the most simple component maybe is that we could take a look at is this color actions, right? Like color actions is a component we created, but it is comprised of a series of very simple elements, what we call JSX elements. And these elements look very similar to HTML in terms of the syntax, but essentially this is JavaScript that is used in order to keep to help make the process of showing those visual elements up a little bit simpler. So part of what the React working with React does is it lets you define the visual elements in a way that looks and feels like HTML. But at the end of the day, all of this is still JavaScript. So the goal of the React library is to make it easier for you to not only have your visual elements defined, but you can also tie them. This is still a JavaScript file, so we can create functions and use variables and do all types of things that JavaScript is good for, while still making a reference to the visual elements in the HTML sense that we would want to change or update or have tied to these various functions and whatnot. And that is what React is really built to help us do. So components are the basic building block of that process. And we use components to basically, in a simple sense, return the JSX we want to see. But we can also add very specific data related functionality into these components that will allow for them to be more sophisticated in how they work and how they handle interactions from users that we want to then change something in the user interface. So the main component here in this app that we worked on the other day was the app component. And this is an example of what we call a functional component. There's two types of components. We'll see the other type in a second, but the first type is a functional component. Function components are meant to be very simple. Like this is a very simple set of code. It's only 10 lines long, but all of this is code's responsible for is returning this particular visual element. I'm going to call it a visual element. This itself is its own custom component, but really we know that this custom component is comprised of other elements. So really this all is just a visual element. So the app, it says in this particular version of the code is saying, hey, whenever the app gets rendered, so in the index.js, when we render the app is going to say, hey, I just want you to return this color container. And the color container then becomes the next component that's going to get rendered by React. So taking a look at the color container, this is an example of what we call a class-based component, which is a little bit more, class-based components are a little bit more, have a little bit more boilerplate to them than functional components, but they also have some really interesting features out of the box that make them very important to still know about these days. In a normal project, you'll see a mix of folks using functional components. You'll see some folks use class components. So it's really important to know that both of them are able to be used. Class components use the React library, extends from the React library. And just like a regular functional component, the goal of the class is to render some actual JSX. So all components, their goal is to quote unquote render JSX, but the difference is in how they're written. In a functional component, you just see them return to JSX very simply, like a function would. But then in the class, there's a very specific render function that gets defined that does the returning of the JSX. So semantic and syntactic differences there. But at the end of the day, you can say that all components have a job of returning some JSX. And the JSX could be either regular elements or it can be custom components of our own that we want to show on the screen. And that's what makes React cool, because you can use these components like color box or color actions here and like refer to them as if they're just a regular element, but that this element is something that you defined and created yourself. This isn't like a default HTML like element. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how this application is working and what we needed to do to make this happen. So we wanted to make an application that would allow us to change the color of this box based on the button that you press. And so first thing we wanted to do was get the visual kind of elements together for this system. So what we needed to do was define those visual elements somewhere. And that's exactly what we did in the color container. So the app returns the color container. So the app.js isn't as necessary at this point. So I'll close that. But the color container becomes like this very important very important component because it's responsible for returning and rendering the actual elements that we want to see. So those elements are, we wanted to see some text. So we used an H1 element to kind of show the text. We wanted to have this box that would be in the middle of the screen. And we also wanted like these kind of like list of different buttons. And that's exactly what the color container returns. But anytime you have multiple elements that you want to return in one place, right? You need what is called a enclosing element or a parent or like a container element. So divs are a very important element in HTML and thereby in React and JSX because they allow you to enclose multiple other components into your in your code. So like if I got rid of the div, you'll see that you get an error that it'll already show you. VS Code is smart enough to already show you this, but it says, hey, JSX expressions must have one parent element. So that's because, you know, we're trying to render three separate things. But the way that rendering works is it expects you to render, if you're going to render a group of things, they should be in an enclosing container. So divs are a great example of one of those types of containers. Tables are also a good example. Forms, and there's a number of assortment of different elements that are those types of elements that you can use as wrapping elements for a number of different other elements. And so that's why we use the div here. And, you know, we put our H1, we wanted to put our box in our actions. And I had suggested, well, maybe we can make the box its own component. And we can do the same with the actions, which would be these buttons here. And so that's how we got these two different other components. So really the job of the color container, first job of the color container was to render the visual elements of the that we wanted to see, right? So we got the H1 and we got the box and the actions. Color box, the goal there was we wanted a box that would allow us to show some color, right? So we built a very simple application, a simple component here. It was just a div, but the thing we did was we used CSS to style that div very specifically with an initial color. So when we first load the page, the initial color here is pink. But that is because color box receives some styling as a default in the color box CSS that is pertinent to that basically sets the original the background color here. So the color box is responsible for taking is basically responsible for showing the box and showing the color, right? That's what that is responsible for. And then lastly, we have the color actions, which, you know, you can see at the bottom, these are just 3 buttons. And the goal was, can we have these 3 buttons be used to let us know what color should we change this box? And so in terms of how we had to render that, you know, it's as simple as, okay, we used another div because we needed like some enclosing component for these 3 buttons that we created, the black button, the red button, and the blue button. Buttons are an element in HTML that are, you know, very, very commonly used. And one of the things that come with buttons is the idea of like, you know, registering when a button gets clicked on, right? And so this is our look at the event handling capabilities of React. In HTML, you can also do event handling and like tie your HTML elements to specific scripts, JavaScript code functions that you want to run. But in React, it makes it also very simple so that you can say, hey, when this button is clicked, I want this particular function to run. And so that's exactly what we have going on here is we have 3 buttons and we defined a function in JavaScript that basically says, hey, when the click is happening, we're going to get the event object that comes back whenever this event on click is triggered. And we're going to do something. And we're going to talk in a second, we're going to talk more deeply about what we did, but we're going to just do something. So these buttons like get clicked, and then this handle click happens and says, hey, we're going to do something here, right? And that's all that the actions needed to be, right? So we needed the buttons to be able to trigger, to let us to like basically say, hey, when was I clicked on and can I do something? We wanted a box that was going to be able to get styling from a style sheet or somewhere, right? And we wanted a bigger kind of parent component that would show the text, the box, and the buttons themselves. Just pausing for check for y'all. Does it make sense what I'm saying so far? Yeah, I'm looking for those thumbs up if you don't know what the awkward pause on my side is. Okay, cool. Appreciate y'all. All right, word. So we can keep going. So cool. So we know the purpose of these three different components. Component one was supposed to be like a big kind of enclosing component. It was like component one, if I had to draw this, was the goal was to be kind of this big blue box that has all of the elements we would want to see, right? Component two was supposed to be very specifically this box, this pink box that we have here, right? That I just marked in yellow. And then component three was going to be like this box that has our buttons, right? So this is how this application is structured. We have one big parent component that is holding a couple of just like some regular elements, but also these two custom components that are very specific to our application. And it's helpful to draw this because, you know, this is how you think with React. It's like, think in the context of, okay, I'm building this application. How do I want to structure this? What components might I need to use? And how will I kind of arrange them so that the formatting of it all is going to kind of pan out the way that I hope it will data-wise. But cool. So let's talk about how we had to actually make this application work, right? And what would go on. So again, just to remind ourselves, if we were to do this in a regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript sense, we have our HTML covered right now, right? We have this HTML here, but now we have these buttons. They're tied to a JavaScript. But what needs to happen to make this all work? Well, somehow the JavaScript needs to keep a record of the active color that's up there right now. So right now, the goal of the JavaScript is to hold a record of this color, right? So it has to keep track of what color is here right now. Second of all, the JavaScript has to then say, okay, whenever a button gets clicked, I want that active color that I have to change, right? So say if we kind of like see how this would work, we have like, I know this is kind of trippy to have like the color not be the same. So I was like, we have pink as the active color, and that gets saved somewhere in the JavaScript, let's say in a JavaScript like cloud of some kind, and say we have like pink somewhere saved in there, right? So then whenever somebody clicks on a button, right, we want, okay, so whenever somebody taps on this button, we now want the JavaScript to say, okay, somebody tapped on the button is step one. So we want to know that happened. So step one is that, check that the thing got clicked. Second of all, we want to then have our application update that defaulted thing and basically say, oh, nope, it's not pink no more. Sorry, you know what I'm saying? Like now it's the default color in here is black, right? And so now the active storage and the memory is that, okay, this is black, right? Until something else comes in here and then changes it again, but then we'll see a similar process take place. The JavaScript has to manage all of that. And then on top of managing kind of this record, it is also responsible for then saying, okay, now take this thing take this color that we have in memory and make it so that this box also turns to that color, right? So step one is recognize the click, step one. Step two is to process that thing is there. And then step three is to change the color that we actively see on the HTML, right? And all three of those steps are very important, but also like not the easiest to do, right? So just gonna pause real quick and make sure y'all with me. That makes sense, right? That's what the JavaScript is responsible for doing, right? Cool. Great. And so, if we were to do that in regular HTML, right? Step one, we would just need the JavaScript to register the click. Step two, that's kind of interesting. How would we keep this record of like what the value of the variable is? We would need some type of running JavaScript system that's keeping a variable in play as the site is also being updated. And that variable is then going to conditionally say, hey, HTML, I want to find this box with JavaScript. I need to find the box. Then I also want to transform the box with that variable I have stored somewhere else, right? It is already mad complicated, even if we were just doing that in regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So here's how you would do this in a React-based sense, right? Here's how React helps you solve that problem. Well, React is all about components, first of all. So we know we have three components. We have our color container, we have color actions, and we have the color box. Well, the way you structure your components is really important because components can pass data to other components using a concept called props. Props is a way for you to pass data from one component to another component. You can only pass props, though, from a parent component to a child component. That's the only way to pass props. So you can pass data, but you can't pass data from one component to like a completely other component. You need to have data passed from one component to another through its parent component. So a parent component is whichever component is responsible for rendering the other component or returning the other component if it's just a functional component. The point of a parent is to just define, okay, here's what I want to have. Here's what I want to have defined, right? And so in this case, right, in color container is the parent component of color box and of color actions, right? Because in the color container component is where we actually return the color box and the color actions, right? In the app, the regular app.js, the app is the parent component of the color container, right? So the app is responsible for returning the color container. Color container is responsible for returning color box and color actions, right? So if we were to see this in like kind of like a hierarchical lens, like a typical tree, it would be like we have the app, right? And then we have the app goes from the app kind of goes into the color container, right? And then the color container has both the color box and the what's it called? Color actions, right? So this is what our application kind of looks like in like a tree-like structure. I'm sorry, I grabbed this and put that drawing like in a weird like format, but it's kind of like this, right? So we got our app main component. The child of the app is the color container, right? And the child of the color container is the color box and the color actions. And that's just how the application is structured because of the way our components are written, right? The app is the one returning a color container is the one returning color box and color actions. So real quick, just, a little check for understanding. Does that make sense to y'all? Just give me some thumbs up if that makes sense. Cool. All right, bet. So like I'm saying, the way that the React components are structured is really important because you can only pass props down like this, right? So with your components, right? You can pass props, but like the way that props works is if the app wants to pass props, it can pass props to the color container, right? If the color container wants to pass props, the color container can pass props to color box or to color actions. That's the only way that it works, right? There's no way for like the color box to pass props to color actions directly. It doesn't work this way as a default in React. So the only way for us to pass data from two kind of sibling components or two components that are on the same level, but is to do kind of this very important step of saying, okay, so say like the color actions wants to talk to color box. How does it do that? It says, oh, I got to talk to color container, and color container is going to talk to color box. That is how that system works, because the only way for your component color box to be talked to is from the parent. So color actions has to talk to the parent, and the parent has to talk to color box. This is the way that components communicate as a default in the React-based landscape. And so this is what we needed to achieve in our application in order to make that process work. So step one was, we defined the visual elements here, and we kind of talked through that. So if you're Gucci on if you're Gucci on step one of this process, just give me some thumbs up so I know that we can move to the second part and talk through what happened next as a second part. All right, cool. So cool. We got the visual components there. So the step two here was we want to be able to understand when color actions is being triggered, right? If we want color actions to essentially tell our container which color got clicked. So if we take a look at color actions, let's see how we did that, right? My bad. I gotta get rid of these for the time being. So color actions is essentially, like we saw, it's just responsible for the buttons, but then the buttons themselves get clicked. And so now what we wanted to do was whenever any of these buttons got clicked, we wanted to pass a value from that button into to our component, to our parent component. And that's exactly why in the button one, we needed to have a value. So each button knew what the value was. And we talked about how the value of each button gets passed in the event object that gets sent. So the event object, again, whenever an event happens in JavaScript, so events are basically user interactions that take place. And so whenever an event, events are not only just user interactions that take place, they're just for lack of better words, they're events that take place in the life cycle of your web application running. So clicks, drags, drops are all user generated events. Whenever a form input gets changed or something gets changed, like that's an event. There's all types of events. But essentially we use this on click event and we say, hey, we're going to pass this value back. And so we see that whenever we actually interact with one of these buttons, so if I click red there in the console, we can see, because I console logged it, we can see that some of that event information gets passed back. Let me actually just console log the event first, and then I'll console log event.target.value. So let this save. And then, why did it not do it for me? Maybe I need to refresh. But basically the event object that gets passed back whenever a application, whenever the event object gets passed back whenever an event is triggered. And we saw how events have a target. An event target will show you what, the event target will show you what HTML element triggered that particular event, right? But the target also passes some data with it. It includes the value. It includes all types of other information. So the target value is always really helpful to keep track of sometimes when you want to know, not only like, hey, like you want to pass some data along with the event from that particular target. So you can set a attribute called value in those specific elements, and that'll get passed in the event handler for you as well. So that's how we ended up being able to say what button got clicked, right? So clearly the button that got clicked was blue. And then just to that diagram we were talking about before, the next step was color actions needs to communicate that to its parent. It needs to communicate that to the color container. Well, here's the conundrum. How does color actions by default talk to its parent, right? There's no real way to find out of the box, right? But we know that a parent can talk to its child through the props that, like we were just saying, like the color container can talk to color actions, but color actions doesn't necessarily have a way to talk to its parent as a default either. So this is why we had to use a very interesting technique to create a way for our other child component to notify us when we wanted to have some notification of some kind. So basically, we needed to give, as a parent component, we needed to give a way for our child component to communicate with us. And that, my friends, was why we created this color should change function, which is a function that we just created in our parent component. We said, okay, I'm gonna create this component, color should change. And at first it was blank, right? There was nothing inside of here. This is just a function that we created. And we passed it down though to color actions as props. So remember, the parent can talk to the child and the parent can define props. So defining props is very simple in React. We can call prop anything and pass a JavaScript object in as data for that prop. One of the things that was tricky about this particular build is that one of the types of data that you might not naturally think that you can use is a function. So you can pass a function down, a reference to a function down to a child component as props. And that's what we did. We passed that function we wrote down. And basically, we're telling this child, hey, whenever you use onColorClicked, whenever you use a prop called onColorClicked, what it's gonna do is it's gonna what that onColorClicked is gonna refer to this function that I created called color should change. And color should change, right? Is then just gonna be passed as a reference, right? So then color actions, whenever we call onColorClicked, is gonna actually be calling this dot color should change, right? And so color actions, right? Where do we use that props onColorClicked? Well, whenever the button gets clicked on in the handle click function, we say, cool, let's call our parent, right? So props.onColorClicked is like basically like a direct line back to our parent. And we say, hey, I'm going to call this function and I'm passing this thing as data. I'm passing event.target.value as data, right? And that is how we were able to let the parent know, here's what the value of the button that got pressed was. And that prop onColorClicked essentially calls this function we triggered, which now, because we know that the function itself is going to receive some value, we can pass a value as a parameter in the function and say, okay, I'm expecting that I'm going to have some color value be passed back from the child. And that is that color value is something we're going to use in the rest of this function. And essentially what the parent component does is it says, okay, I'm going to take that color value and I'm going to do something important with it to store a reference to that. I'm going to store a reference to that color value. And so, yeah, I want to pause real quick and just make sure that that piece makes sense of like, in order to allow for our child to talk to the parent, we needed to pass some function down that was going to serve as the medium through which our child component was going to be able to connect and talk back to us as a parent component. Because we can only send data down. I can only send data to color actions from the parent. I can't just naturally from this external file reference the parent component unless there was a prop that was passed to allow me to do so. But yeah, does that piece make sense? I know that's where things get a little bit murky, a little confusing, but I'm trying my best to explain it in a way that makes a lot more sense. Any questions? Cool. So yeah, we'll keep it pushing then. So essentially we're calling our parent here, passing that value. And now, so that takes care of step one for this bigger picture thing we were talking about, right? Step one was when this button gets clicked, we want to register that it got clicked. And we also want to notify, in the React context, we want to notify the parent component so that we can start sending data to the color box, right? So first step was, okay, we're notifying the parent's being passed this data that then it can use in that function to do that. And so one of the things that is a very important concept in React to talk about, so that we just talked about one of those concepts, which is props, right? That's a very important concept in React, is this idea that you can always pass data from one parent component to another component by defining a data value and passing a data object to that child component. And then the child component can make reference to that data by using props. So props is the data transfer from parent to child. We can see some slight, there's definitely differences in the way that like class-based components use props in state, which we'll talk about in a second, and how functional components do as well. But essentially, once you kind of get over the little differences in the syntax, both components use props and do that very well. So that's how we pass the data down and how we got the data passed back up. So cool, figured that part out. The next step was, remember we drew that little cloud on the side here that said like, okay, we want to keep a record of whatever that thing was that got passed, right? So whenever color value comes back, we want to keep a record of that somehow so that we can keep it and update it. So remember, whenever the cloud was regularly pink, right? What happened was, oh, well, whenever we click this button, it stopped being pink and like it got crossed out and it got turned into black, and something is saving this for us until the next thing comes and changes it. And in React, data like that is going to be changed over time and is going to be manipulated over time, internal to a component, is best saved as state, component state. And state is basically an object that you can define either in a class-based component, like so, where you create a constructor and you essentially create the state object out of the constructor like this. Basically, state is an object that can keep value pairs in JavaScript. And you can use it to save various data in this kind of context that will be able to be updated by the component later, which is why whenever the color value comes back from the color actions, we set the state with the color that came back, the color value that we got back from the child component. Setting the state here was just our means of achieving that like little clouded bubble of like data that was being saved, right? That's what the state is good for, is like having some data that eventually is gonna get like the value of the state is to have some data that is gonna be like kind of just saved and like transitioned over time. So it's gonna go from pink to like, you know what I'm saying, like to you know what I'm saying, to like black, and then like all of the above. So it always will keep a record of the most updated version of whatever the data is that we want to save. So whenever you think you have a system like this you need to keep in place, or some data that's going to be recorded somewhere and then changed later by something else that inside of that component, the important thing is that the data is changed from inside of the component. That's when you want to use state. So clearly, this parent component is important because we need the parent component to hold the data and then pass it back into the color box, right? Because our goal was color actions, talk to color container talks to color box. And so in order to make that happen, color actions notifies color container, right? That's what this function was about, notifying color container. Color container saves the data in the state. The state holds that value, and then essentially we can pass that data down to the color box as props, right? Because as a parent, I can talk to this component as with props. So I can make a prop for color box that is that gets data from me that I can that it can use when it is rendering itself. But the unique thing is color actions we pass a prop to color actions to change basically this prop that color actions is receiving on this color should change function is manipulating the state. The state is something internal to color container, but because the state can change, the color container is able to change the state whenever it wants. That basically allows for color actions to essentially change the state. And when color actions changes the state, that means that whenever this prop that we pass down to color box, which is the state, is going to update automatically whenever this state value changes. This is a very important concept. We're just basically saying, I'm passing a prop to a child that is going to change over time. I'm going to change this prop over time, right? And I'm going to change this prop as I'm notified by another component that inside of this greater ecosystem as well, right? So color actions is updating the state of the color container. It's updating the color container state. The color container state is being passed as a prop to the color box, which basically makes the color box's color prop changeable, and is gonna be changed by the color container whenever the color container gets notified that it should change, right? So the state is really important to be kind of this record that we can not only change from the color container, but we can also pass down to these other components inside of the color container as props that they might need to keep a record of as things are changing for themselves. And that's why the color box, lastly, was able to then receive props, right? And essentially, we just used the props in a very unique way where we took the color that we were getting, right? And we basically added some styling conditionally to this div that says, hey, the class name of the div is going to be color box, but it also might have another color. It might also have another class name tied to it that's going to be passed as props.color. And these class names are only important because we use this CSS file for the color box to keep track of the styles, right? And we have these different styles here that have those different class names, pink, red, black, and blue. And so those different class names are why whenever props.color gets passed into the color box, the background color is going to change because color box is receiving those two class names as a default. So let's just take a look at this in the inspector and kind of just see this happening live. So the main elements that we're talking about here are all in that div with the ID root that we saw before. Whenever you give a component a class name, that class name ends up showing up as a class, like an HTML-like class in the actual HTML, which is important to know. So that's how you can also keep track of your elements. So clearly color container is here. There's a div for the color container, and you can see it takes up all of the visual elements. the H1 is in there. And then our color box, remember, color box itself was a custom component, but it gets turned into what it actually is, which is just a div, right? And there was nothing in the color box JS outside of this div, right? So that's what it ends up being seen in as HTML. And then the color actions is the same. It's just another div that's holding a bunch of buttons, right? So the point here is that whenever one of these buttons gets clicked, you see how color box, well, it might be a little hard for y'all to see, but you see how the color box is, it says color box. This div has two classes. It has color box and it has black, right? Well, whenever we switch the button, you see how the class name is being altered now? So now it says color box blue, color box red, color box black, right? So this is happening conditionally because of the JavaScript, right? Remember I said that JavaScript can manipulate not only just the elements themselves, but the attributes themselves as well with the DOM. And React makes it very simple for us to do all of this DOM manipulation without even remembering that that's what we're doing, right? That's where this gets so, that's where all this complexity is coming in, but the complexity is making it so you don't have to remember that on top of the complexity of what you're trying to do, there's all this other complexity of how to do it, right? And so it's as simple in this JavaScript syntax here. What we basically created was a templated string. And a templated string in JavaScript is actually a really important concept to know as well, where normally in strings in JavaScript, we use single quotes or we use double quotes. If you use a backtick in JavaScript, you're creating what's called a templated string, which basically is a string that allows you to also add JavaScript variables and data inside of it. So color box is like treated like a regular string. The space is also treated like a regular space, but then this $ and curly bracket syntax basically says you can pass a JavaScript, JavaScript data here. And so we pass props.color, which is what we were getting back from the parent. And remember, props.color for us is just a prop. I don't know anything about it. I just use it as a child component. I got it from the parent, I'm using it. But the color container knows that props.color for the color box is really this.state.color, which is this very mutable piece of data that's going to change over time whenever the color container is notified by the color actions that are being triggered by the user. So the user messes with color actions, these buttons there, those buttons trigger this function that tells the color container, hey, yo, you should update the state. The state is updated so that we can keep a record of it. And in keeping a record of it, we can pass that record that we are keeping track of to our other component as props that it can use to change itself over time as well. And that is, my friends, how this application that seems like it should be seemingly simple is not as simple as it kind of leads us on to think it is. But we also get a sense of like how React makes things a little bit more relatively straightforward to understand by using the JSX and using the components and allowing us to write the JavaScript into the components versus having to do all those DOM manipulation functions and set up the HTML and CSS and JavaScript separately. But cool, just kind of show it thumbs. Does this make sense? Is this making sense now? A lot more than from the other day. Just kind of looking at this one more time and understanding how state and props and all of this kind of connect. Dope. Appreciate y'all who are dropping thumbs and stuff like that. Appreciate that. Cool. Any other questions just about this whole thing? Okay, word. Well, dope. Well, yeah. So that's just basically kind of the how that React system works, and just a refresher of like where we're at, like, and being able to use React to do all of this like kind of really interesting JavaScript manipulation in very easy ways, outside of just the regular JavaScript way of doing it. Because either way, it was going to be complicated if we didn't use React or if we did use React. But because the JavaScript around manipulating things is difficult. But React makes that part a little bit easier. But you have to use React state and props very uniquely to create the data transfer that you really want to achieve. And that's what can also be a little bit confusing when you're first getting started with React. But yeah, I really recommend, if y'all are really like looking for more information on like to understand this process, reading through the React docs, the main concepts. These are all of the concepts. All these concepts are really important. And so we talked about JSX, we talked about rendering elements, we talked about components and props, we talked about state. We didn't talk as much about lifecycle as much, though we did use a constructor. We talked about handling events with the buttons and whatnot. Conditional rendering is essentially, we basically talked about it in the sense that, like in the color box, we're rendering something based on like circumstantial things going on with the data in the state. Conditional rendering allows us to then say stuff like, if the state is blah, like do blah, or if props are blah, do blah, right? So that's more what conditional rendering is, which we'll talk about pretty soon, you know. But yeah, everything else, lifts and keys, forms, lifting state up was that process we were talking about, with like passing the state around and whatnot. But yeah, these are the main concepts, and all of this, like, as you can see, kind of get utilized and as you're building out these more sophisticated applications. But yeah. Any other questions on just this piece or anything?
I don't have any questions, Professor.
Nice. Appreciate that. Dope.